أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وإذ قال ربك للملائكة إني جاعل في الأرض خليفة قالوا أتجعل فيها من يفسد فيها ويسفك الدماء ونحن نسبح بحمدك ونقدس لك قال إني أعلم ما لا تعلمون. The translation of this ayat is from Surah Al-Baqarah, ayat 31. And when thy Lord said to the angels, I am about to place a vicegerent or a successor in the earth, they said, wilt thou place therein such as will cause disorder in it and shed blood? And we glorify thee with thy praise and extol thy holiness. He answered, I know what you know not. Today in my dars, I will be continuing on the same theme about why we should learn the Holy Quran. And I'm at the fourth point, which I'm covering. That is about the individual freedoms and understanding them. Whether we should have complete freedom, balance in freedom. What does freedom really mean? Or should we cut off from communal life? And what does religion have to do with this, or the Holy Quran? So in understanding this, this aspect of the divine law in introducing against the prevailing system, or is it now with the prevailing society choosing to live free, unrestricted from following a code or ethics from religion? And actually, this verse which I chose from the Holy Quran is actually about that very subject, about establishing a system in the world and creating a system. And when you create a system, all systems have to have rules and regulations. When rules and regulations are set in, then there are some freedoms which are naturally not going to be there anymore. And there's going to be some restrictions and restraints, obviously. And the interesting thing is that there is a parallel between the Prophet Adam, who came and brought actually the first law and the first establishment of civilization. And the parallel is between that and today, where when you could imagine the time when law was first being introduced to a society where people did not have it, how they would not accept it. And in today's world, we see that prevailing in the Western countries and now around the world to some degree, there is also a similar situation where people want to have less restrictions put on them. And so Hazrat Khalifah Masih Sani Razila Talan, he described this by in detail about the situation in his speech, Real Revolution, about the era and civilization which was established by Hazrat Adam alayhi salam. So he says that this shows that Adam was the prophet who laid the earliest. Now he's commenting on that verse. Actually, he's highlighting that verse. It lays the earliest foundation of human civilization and culture, creating an order in human activity which has not existed before. The Adam spoken of here, however, is not the Adam who was the progenitor of the human race, the first person to be brought to human race. But this Adam was the originator of the civilized human life. In other words, before the time of this Adam, man had not yet attained a stage of social life where he could be the bearer of a law. Till then, man had, in fact, developed no instincts, nor was he such as could rightly be called a human being, even in the most rudimentary sense as we know it. The utmost that he could be said of him being no more that he represented a higher kind of brute animal life. It is, however, a fact that man's progress has followed a line of constant evolution. To begin with, he went through a phase of existence when he was no doubt a higher kind of being than the other current forms of animal life, but he had not yet developed an entity that deserved to be given a life everlasting. So as we were saying, that there was a distinction before the law came between man, human beings, and animals and other forms of life. There is definitely a distinction, but he's saying here that they did not deserve before that to be given eternal life. So their development, spiritual development, was not there yet. So this evolution of spirituality is explained actually here in that point, that there must have been a point from the origin of man from the creation of man, which I won't go into detail on that because I'll take off track. I'll just mention that this subject I will be talking in my classes throughout the year, Dars al-Quran classes. So, but at this evolutionary stage, when Adam came, Hazur is talking about here is that he was now evolved to that stage where he can receive salvation, where spiritually he is evolved to that stage. So then he says that when he rose a step higher, so that's to this stage when he can receive the law, from this stage, however, and his brain developed to an extent where he could be the bearer of a law, the first principle he was given was that he should live a corporate, or you could say communal life along with others of his kind, under a chief or a head or a leader to whom he should owe allegiance. The first lawgiver taught no more than an elementary form of worship, with emphasis on life in a communal and social setup, or a common and social setup under a chief who was to decide all matters on which disputes might happen to arise. The name of the lawgiver was Adam. It was in the course of this stage of human development that the sexual relationship between the male and the female was put on the basis of permanent union. So here, as we was talking about the marriage, the setup of the basis of a marriage started. That's what it means by permanent union. So that's the marriage system was established at that time, and there having been no principle previously to regulate this relationship. So you see now the parallels that are coming, where the rejection of even the family system in today's day and age, or different forms of the family union is there. But the regulation of it was set down in place, and it must have been at that time, a big upset for the people, which Hazur explains in his lecture. And we are seeing that parallel in today. And it's so fascinating that the Holy Quran has actually outlined these things for us, that how the development of law started and how the civilization started, how the different currents of thoughts were there for or against, the establishment of laws and regulations. So Hazur then says that then when Allah expressed his desire to create a Khalifa in the earth, the angels pondered over all aspects of the principle of government, and they discovered a new concept, that there was also a possible kind of discord and bloodshed, and that such actions would often proceed from Adam, when they would be taken as commendable in the sight of the Lord, no evil and not evil and not reprehensible. So those clashes or conflict, if it's taken in a system, which is who's going to explain, they are not actually evil, they're not wrong if force is used. And since therefore there had been no instance of a system of government on the earth, the development naturally struck the angels as very strange. Very much in the same way, some people criticize the wars which the Holy Prophet ﷺ had to fight, or they criticize the permissibility of capital punishment for homicide. So Azur is making a parallel between today's day and age when the use of force is being used to punish, capital punishment for someone who kills someone else wrongfully. There's criticism for that. So it's a similar thing. Azur is running a parallel, and then also the wars, we all know the wars were fought in defense and for actual punishment for only those heinous crimes that were meted out to the Muslim when they were severely weak and without any means of defense, and completely unjustified. So God answered the angels by saying, I know what you know not. You cannot visualize the advantages of such a system. Although the establishment of a settled government legalizes certain forms of force and pressures, and although it interferes to a certain extent with individual liberty, on the whole, this system of force and pressure is beneficial for the corporate, or I just wrote communal, which makes more sense, for the communal life of the nation, as well as the life of the individual. Eventually, too, civilization means just this, that certain kinds of clash and bloodshed are legalized and sanctified. Murder is liable, but when the offender is apprehended and executed by the government, the state is not looked upon as having become guilty of murder. Rather, in fact, its action is considered fully sanctified. Similarly, for anyone to take forcible possession of another person's house or land is reprehensible, but in cases of national requirements, when a government takes such possessions, it is held fully entitled to do so. Unlawful detention of anybody, too, is oppression, but when duly constituted authority takes this action, it is held to be perfectly justified. Therefore, when God said that he was about to civilize the world, that he was going to appoint one individual as Khalifa who would enforce a law under which he would punish those guilty of murder, would sometimes take possession of the property of some people and interfere with individual liberty, the angels were amazed because they had never known anything of that kind before. For the people of that early period, this point was of a staggering nature. In fact, even today, it is far from having attained an undisputed position. We find that in Europe, there is a fairly large number of people who are opposed to the imposition of capital punishment. I mean, this lecture would have been done over quite some time ago, 1960s or prior. So now, even if we take into consideration how much this has taken place, here this was 1937. So now we're almost 100 years later, 90 years later, and definitely this concept of capital punishment is something which is arguably argued by certain elements in society that claim that it's something harsh and against the goodness of mankind. So just coming back on this text, it says, but the fact of the matter is that the government does not only execute certain people, it also commits certain other deeds which have an appearance very similar to those of certain crimes. For instance, it forces people to surrender portions of their incomes and properties in the form of taxes. If the objection mentioned above is held valid, it will have to be conceded that no government is justified in forcing people to pay taxes. But these people do not object to government receiving taxes, which shows in turn that the objection against capital punishment too is rather a fanciful one, which springs from lack of due thought. So as we were saying, that's something which should be used more thought to if they want to really understand the benefit of this, and they're not using their faculty of pondering over the real use of this. And that's the purpose of discussing these points here in this sermon, and also discussing today about the actual reasoning and understanding, so we can think about all of these things and not just take some extreme opposite sides or two extremes thoughts. The very essence of civilization, Hizur says, is that thus it just that all those actions which are considered bad and reprehensible are called the basis of culture and human progress when a government has recourse to them. No one objects to these actions on the part of the state, but when an individual takes the same course, he is fully guilty and duly punishable. So in the, basically what we're saying is that, if you look in the modern day, when any army goes out to establish peace, it goes out and says, we're going to establish peace, we're going to set up a democratic system because oppression is there, but we have to go and we have to use force. So when they're doing this, it's obvious that they're doing this in the name of progress and culture, to establish progress and culture, right? But which is what they're using, force in order to do that. So then he goes on to say that when first the human mind took this stupendous step under the impulse of divine revelation, it was a revelation that must have most severely taxed the intellectual power of the human group first addressed. So it was very heavy on those who, the intellectual minds at that time, to accept what he was saying. So naturally, for the wild people of the era, the demand must have been bewildering that they should submit to the authority of one from among themselves who, against their own inclinations, would have a measure of control over what they possessed, and would in certain cases, even inflict the death penalty. Quite understandably, the first generation reached to such a demand must have been a violent urge to reject and throw away this new control. So that's why the angel said, are you going to be sending a Khalifa who's going to create bloodshed, right? Because it was, the people were at that time would have created quite an uproar, and their response would have been, as we were saying, is violent. Then commenting on some people of today, which have begun to act like people of Adam, when they confronted this law for the first time, Huzur says that ideas of this kind, so he's explaining this phenomenon today, are an indication that a decline has set in the mental capacities of the people of Europe, in some respects anyway, and it is people of this kind who became the cause of weakness in the authority of established governments. The only difference between those who indulge in such confused thinking at this day and the primitive savages who tended to defy the law when first it came into human affairs is this, that the idea of ordered society having become firmly rooted in the human mind, it no longer occurred to anyone that the system of government by law should be done away with altogether. So that was the difference between the time of Adam and the time now, because it's so ingrained in the mind, people can never think that, okay, we have to give up the system of government altogether. The idea, nevertheless, keeps cropping up in various forms that another government differently constituted would perhaps be more mindful of their rights, this being the reason why attempts are from time to time being made to effect change in systems of government. So people don't completely nowadays, they don't give up on the system of government. They look to see change within it by changing it from within. Among the primitive people, of whom there still are a fairly large number, the tendency even now is that they disapprove of all systems of control in an ordered society. Submission to any such order is extremely painful for them, and they fail to understand why other people want to interfere with them. And so he said that we gave this example that he's giving an example of some people of that extreme side, which are don't really fit into this order today, that those say that if we find it more convenient to go about naked, what right has anybody to force us to wear garments? Our limbs are freer, and we get more air if we remain naked. And in any case, it suits us. Why should anyone want to interfere with our personal likes and dislikes? So this was the dialogue, as we were saying, about people who reject the system and in place. And this is Hazur. Then he gives a description of how when the colonial British powers, when they were in Africa, and he explained on how when they tried to civilize those tribes there and make them to wear clothes, that was their process of of trying to civilize them. And then he said that this is a symptom of decay in the Western society, that nowadays people are, they're also moving backwards, sort of in the evolutionary, in evolutionary advancement of society. They're actually moving backwards. It's sort of like a deterioration, right? So it's in the name of in individual freedoms, we're seeing more of society sort of turning, reverting back to what the people were like prior to Adam coming with a law. And when this is not a criticism, this is just a way which we should look at and understand that there's maybe some kind of a there's some kind of a misunderstanding people have. They may not really understand when they see people, Muslims, for instance. But it's just that when we see the Muslim, and I'm just adding this myself, this thought that when we are confronted with the Western nations who have this idea that have moved away from the dress and it moving slowly or away from sort of having a more modest sort of approach and advanced, which shows an advancement of civilization rather than anything else. They look at Muslims as being backwards, whereas in fact, we look at it in another way. We look at it as though this is a part of the establishment of civilization and an evolution of civilization. So it's obvious that at the stage when Islam would come, that it should have evolved to a certain extent where moderation in dress should be part and parcel of civilization. And but that's not the way Muslims are looked at. When they wear a headscarf, when they are looked at as modest, they think otherwise. That no, they actually place Muslims as the ones who are backwards and far behind, and whereas Muslims are looking the other way. So anyhow. The reason we should understand this is that Allah is cleared these things up for us in the Holy Quran, and has not made it so muddled and so confused, this matter. And that's what I'm going to explain here about this communal system and the ways in which the very basis of this civilization was established. In the very next portion of his lecture, Hazur then quoted these verses from the Holy Quran, which talk about these basic laws which were put in place to help to bring about peace in the society. And I'll just read the Arabic first in the translation. Inna laka alla taju'a fiha wa la ta'ara wa annaka la tazma'u fiha wa la tadha. Chapter 20, verses 119 to 120. It is provided for thee that thou wilt not hunger therein, nor wilt thou be naked, and thou wilt not thirst therein, nor wilt thou be exposed to the sun. Hazur says that speaking on the advantages of Hazur will be speaking on the advantages of the civilized life in the time of Adam, where he says that today perhaps you feel inclined to laugh at those who doubt the value of certain controls on human actions in the interests of all. But when this question was first by Adam, it must have created a violent commotion in human group addressed, with tempers rising and blood flowing in many cases. When Adam called upon his people to take to some sort of clothing, many unruly spirits must have raised a violent protest to the proposed measure, involved intolerable interference with their freedom of thought and action. To overcome this strong opposition, Adam was taught to take his stand on a rational, social basis. If you agree to live in the proposed ordered unit called a Jannat, so this is how we understand now Jannat. So first we talked about putting that the head of that system, and now the name of that system is called Jannat. The government system is called Jannat. You will no longer be exposed to the pains of hunger and thirst, nor have to suffer at the hands of inclement weather or extreme weather. This is the verses just quoted. Here is the earliest root of the functions of a state established on the basis of moral and social concepts, that it should work for the well-being of the people. The verse in the Holy Quran bears on this point has been grossly misunderstood to mean that Adam was kept in some place where he and those with him were not subject to hunger and thirst. So, so the misunderstanding that is there, that can be mixed up also with the Christian idea that, Jannat was actually heaven and Adam was kicked out of it. This is not what it means. This is the misunderstanding explained. And that's why we should learn the Holy Quran. And that's why we are blessed to be a part of this dispensation of the revival of Islam, which actually explained rationally what it actually was, which was that we would not have hunger, meaning we won't go hungry. There'll be food there. We won't be thirsty because there'll be food there for us within that system. And that system was Jannat because it would be like a Jannat. It would be like a paradise because all our needs would be provided for us in that. So then he says that the fact is that the verse lays down the basic duties of a government as conceived by the Islamic point of view, namely that it should create channels for useful employment of the people placed under its care, should Sorry, I just lost my place here. There was a call that I was. I'm sorry, I just had an urgent call that I lost my place. Sorry, so just we'll go back again. The fact is that the verse lays down the basic duties of a government as conceived by the Islamic point of view, namely that it should create channels for a useful employment of the people placed under its care, should look to the fundamental needs within the system that is being placed in this government, all the needs of the people, even if they have work, they should also be taken care of. And also clothing should be granted, also house should be there so that people can be protected from the outside weathers. And this is the basis of the system established. And Hazur goes on to say that if people protested against the new order, Adam was directed to explain to them the advantages it would bring. If they submitted to it, they would be placed in a condition where they would not ever have to go without food. They would not have to go out without clothes, being naked in the sun and rain, and they would have supplies of food and water as they like, and place a home for their rest. And evidently, if a government made sure of these four things, it would have to be judged one of the best, even accorded to modern standards. So if we can see that, even conceive of that kind of system even today in Canada, that would be a great system, even at its primary stage. And Adam, Hazur finally says that Adam's people were thus told that restrictions upon individual freedom and action were no doubt bothersome, but they were in the best interest of the group, for they would enable the new social setup to take care of their needs better than they could themselves individually, ensuring a lasting condition of prosperity and peace called Jannat, or paradise, a place of bliss. So what did we learn from this illustration from Adam, and why is it important to know? So we first of all have to understand that when we want to look to set up a system, and I was actually thinking over this before, that if we want to set up a system of a government and we understand it in a society and where it has freedoms and it has rules and regulations, then the Holy Quran actually, aside from the betterments of spirituality, it also looks to the betterments of the moral conduct of people, and also setting up a government system which can be run, which are guidances which are there to help the people to run their day-to-day government so that it can be beneficial for everyone, right? So the good thing about this is the Holy Quran is not, making it difficult for us to go back and figure out how you can start everything and how the foundation should be laid and how it should be set and how we should go on from there. It tells us and clears everything, and it actually sort of unifies the concept or brings together the religious aspect, the moral aspect, spiritual aspect, and it gives it it shows that there is no contradiction or misunderstanding between them. They actually make sense and they can cohabitate together. So religion can benefit man, and it has benefited, and in the other way, religion also can benefit from from man when it chooses to develop, when it chooses to follow the religion. So the points which we learned here, that one is that how God in the beginning started his rudimentary first law, divine law. What was the purpose for it? To civilize man. And then secondly, it also cleared up the misunderstandings that we had about Prophet Adam, alayhi salatu wasalam. And it also laid the foundation for what was the purpose for sending law. And we can see that when Prophet Muhammad came, similarly, and in every age, whenever a prophet came with a law, it was always against the system, but we can see that it was always there for the benefit of everyone. And then the other point that we learned is that there is a process of evolution that has taken place, and this is mentioned. These evolutionary steps of divine law are actually mentioned also in the Holy Quran, and so it goes in line also with the idea, the modern day idea, that there is an evolutionary process that has taken place in civilization, in also in the evolution of man physically, and so there may be, when we look at the parallels between the first time that Adam came and with his law and the parallels now, many similarities, and the reasons which, to sort of summarize the reasons which we understand why there is people have rejected those laws which came prior to Islam, were, as I mentioned before, they were basically because they had changed, or they did not suit for a universal time, and they have been corrupted, and they needed to be reformed through another prophet coming, or mujaddid, or they also rejected, or they couldn't be followed because they were so corrupted and taken over by unjust rulers that people, they tended to move away from them, and because the religions were unjust or illogical. Islam, on the other hand, its law, and I'm going to now mention about these things in the next dars, about those aspects of the Holy Quran which we find are practical and we can follow, and we see that they're applicable, they make sense. So the Holy Quran's teachings were not changed. They were not. They do not also go against the logic and reasoning. Why could they have been rejected today? First by Muslims, not because of being changed literally, but being changed by their meanings by people later on. So they need a reformer, or because perhaps their interpretation became extreme, and the people practicing the faith was actually not the true teaching of Islam, and it brought people away because they could not logically and justifiably say that this is a true Islam which you're doing. So people moved away from that. That could be a reason why people reject the law of the Holy Quran. But the reason why non-Muslims would reject it would be based on prejudice, or maybe misunderstanding of the teachings, and not having a deep understanding of it. But when we actually see the 1,000 years that the Christians were, they dominated over the European nations, we find that the Europeans, non-Muslims, they started to, the logic and rationality and the harmony between religion and science started to take on massive momentum within Europe. And this was called the Enlightenment period, or the Renaissance period. And people started to move away from the traditional religion. There were splits and splinters into Christianity, and people were looking for religious freedom. That when now we're following a different way of Christianity, we want religious freedom. They were actually seeing how religious freedom was being practiced by Islam, which was an Islamic system put in place, a universal system put in place. And they also understood the secularism, that there is not a contradiction between the laws of nature and the sciences, and that we can teach science and we can look to science for our betterment and to improve our life. And they saw that this was being practiced, and they were influenced by it because Europe was being educated by the Muslims, either by the scholars through translations or through universities, through their own scholars who had learned from the Muslims themselves through universities or through translations or from scholars. And this we can find in Europe had a big, tremendous change. And the change towards enlightenment came about because of this great transformation, because the Muslims were putting together the sciences and building upon it, and they were putting together science and religion and propelling that idea into the society, which was going against the mainstream Christianity. And I have some examples here of, a very well-known French historian, writer, Boulainvilliers, and Henri de Boulainvilliers. He wrote so many amazing things about Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. He wrote a book about him, La Vie de Muhammad, which it inspired, when I mentioned before Voltaire, who was extremely against Islam in the beginning, but when he learned from his writings, he actually changed his viewpoint. Voltaire changed his viewpoint, but Voltaire wanted to bring about secularism, religious freedom into society. He was very critical of the rigidity of the church, and he was looking at the non-rigidity actually in Islam, and he mentioned that. And one of the things which Boulainvilliers, which he had mentioned actually, is interesting, is that Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he said here, I quote it, says that Muhammad's doctrine merely removed all that was irrational and undesirable about Christianity, and was practiced at the time. So this is a very interesting insight into from a Christian scholar about Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and his teachings, which are the Holy Quran, which to his understanding was to take all the irrational and undesirable things away from Christianity. And I explained that in my very beginning dars about the irrational understanding about the law being a curse, and meaning that, and I explained that what Islam explained through that when it came was that if you take your religion to the extreme of its practice, but you don't follow up through good behavior, then your prayer, as it mentioned in the Quran, your prayer becomes a curse. So Hazrat Muslim Maud actually explained these points, and he said why Muslims didn't actually fall to the prey of this problem. And it's interesting that this scholar, French scholar, understood this, and he mentioned it. And this is the reason why we should actually turn to the Holy Quran, because it brings about understanding about the irrational things of previous faiths. And even I'm not saying that based on what the Quran says or what our scholars say, but I'm giving you reference here about how it actually cleared the minds of the Europeans, and they started looking into their faith differently. It's fascinating, and this is the reason why we should go into learning the Holy Quran, because the Holy Quran brought people back to God rather than away from God. They brought them back towards their teachings of God rather than moving away from it. So this is the legacy of the Holy Quran. This is the history. This is the benefits that we get from it. Jazakumullah. Inshallah, we'll continue on the same subject tomorrow, inshallah, and request everyone to continue to pray these last few days of the month of Ramadan. We should pray for Allah's forgiveness and remember Durood Sharif. We should pray for all the Muslims in general, and as Huzur said in his Friday sermon, to pray that the effects of the coronavirus removed, that we all Ahmadis are safe from it, that the whole world is safe. Continue to pray and focus on that. May Allah bring about an understanding in the minds of the people so that they can really turn towards God, towards goodness, and they get benefit from this life rather than a punishment. May Allah make them understand that. May Allah forgive us, forgive the world. Pray that Allah shows His mercy and people, they turn towards Allah in these last few days. Jazakumullah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.